I've dealt with some of the worst cases in my career. Trauma cases, infants, decomposition so advanced we had to seal the room afterward. I've followed protocol in situations most people couldn't stay conscious through. And in total, I've likely embalmed close to 1,200 people in my career. In those 1,200 embalmings, I have only ever refused to embalm one of them. Not because I was scared, not because it was damaged beyond saving, so that the family could avoid a mandatory closed casket service. I refused this one because halfway through preparation, I realized the body was actively showing signs of something I had never seen before. And if I continued, I would be crossing a professional line that no funeral director is supposed to cross. I've been licensed for 14 years, and in that time, I've learned not to question the dead or the people who work with the deceased. I work in a mid-sized family-owned funeral home in central Pennsylvania. We handle between 60 and 80 cases a year. The work is routine in the way surgery is routine. Precise, methodical, emotionally distant. You follow protocol because the liability of mistakes can not only scar the family, but can easily make you lose your license. Embalming is not mystical. It's a sanitation and preservation process governed by state law and professional standards. You are temporarily preserving human remains for viewing and burial. That's it. The procedure itself is straightforward. We receive a body from a hospital or a morgue. Then the body is refrigerated until we're ready. Once ready, we make a small incision near the collarbone or groin. We insert a tube into the carotid or femoral artery and introduce formaldehyde-based preservation fluid under a specific pressure. Simultaneously, we drain blood and interstitial fluids from the jugular or femoral vein. Once arterial embalming is complete, we perform cavity embalming, aspirating the thoracic and abdominal organs, then injecting cavity fluid. Finally, we suture, seal, position, and dress the body. The entire process takes between 2 and 4 hours, depending on the condition of the remains. You work in silence, usually alone. You maintain focus. You document everything: temperature, pressure readings, fluid volumes, tissue response, duration of each phase. These records protect you legally and ensure quality control. In 14 years, I've handled every kind of case: bodies pulled from water after days of submersion, fire victims where identification required dental records, industrial accidents where the remains arrived in pieces, elderly patients who died peacefully in hospice care, newborns who never left the hospital. Each one follows the same protocol. Each one gets the same care, the same attention to detail, the same professional distance that allows me to do this work without falling apart. After so many years in this line of work, you learn to read a body in a way that most people find scary or even disgusting. You know what normal looks like, what normal feels like, what normal sounds like when the embalming machine is running and the fluid is moving through vessels the way it should. You know the difference between difficult and impossible, between unusual and wrong. I've had difficult cases. I've had cases where I had to adjust technique, modify procedure, think creatively to achieve the result the family needed. That's part of the job. That's what 14 years of experience gives you, the ability to adapt while staying within the bounds of what's acceptable. What happened that September night wasn't difficult, it was wrong. I'm telling you this because what happened only matters if you understand how it's supposed to work. The body arrived on a Thursday in late September around 7:30 in the evening. I was alone in the prep room finishing paperwork from an earlier case. A 72-year-old woman, natural causes, straightforward embalming. Our director, Alan, had already left for the day. The doorbell chime echoed through the building. Delivery entrance. I met the transport team at the loading bay. 2 guys I'd seen before, contract drivers from a hospital 40 minutes south. They had the gurney halfway out of the van before I reached them. "Evening," the older one said. He handed me a clipboard. 68-year-old male, natural causes. I glanced at the paperwork. Name, date of birth, time of death, attending physician. Everything was there, but the handwriting was rushed, and the physician's signature was illegible. Not unusual for a busy hospital. The intake form listed the death as cardiopulmonary failure. No autopsy, no medical examiner involvement. "Family arranging service?" I asked. "Already done," he said. "Paid in full this afternoon. Closed casket, no viewing." That gave me pause. Families usually want to see the body one last time, even if there's no public viewing. Closed casket from the start is rare, though not unheard of. Sometimes it's cultural, sometimes financial, sometimes people just want it over with quickly, especially with elderly relatives who've been sick for a long time. "All right," I said. I signed for the transfer. They wheeled the gurney inside. I helped them move the body onto our table, and they left without much conversation. Standard procedure. I locked the bay door and returned to the prep room. The body was in a standard black pouch, zipped and tagged. I checked the tag against the paperwork. Name matched, date of birth matched. Time of death was listed as approximately 32 hours prior. I unzipped the bag. He looked like what the paperwork said, late 60s, average build, male. Pale, as expected, no visible trauma, eyes closed, mouth slightly open, thin gray hair receding, a small scar on his left temple, old and faded. I've seen thousands of faces like this. I resealed the pouch and moved him into refrigeration. We don't embalm the night of intake unless there's a scheduling conflict or the body is in poor condition. I made a note to start first thing in the morning, then locked up and went home. The next morning, I arrived at 7:30. I prepped the room, instruments sterilized, fluids mixed according to standard concentration, drainage system checked and connected. I pulled the body from refrigeration at 8:15 and positioned it on the table under the overhead light. The refrigeration unit hummed in the background. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly. Outside, traffic was picking up on Main Street. Everything was normal. Everything was routine. I unzipped the pouch fully and began my external examination. This is standard. You check for anything that might complicate embalming. Pacemakers, medical devices, signs of infectious disease, recent surgeries. You also verify basic details, approximate weight, identifying marks, consistency with reported cause of death. It's as much about protecting yourself as it is about respecting the deceased. The weight felt off, not drastically, but enough that I noticed when we'd transferred him the night before. The paperwork listed him at 172 pounds. He felt closer to 180, maybe 185. That's not a red flag on its own. Hospital weights aren't always accurate, especially post-mortem. Fluid shifts, rigor mortis. Even the angle of the scale can throw things off by 5 or 10 pounds. Rigor mortis had mostly passed, which aligned with the reported time of death. Approximately 36 hours prior by now. But the distribution was uneven. His jaw and neck were still moderately stiff, while his limbs were fully relaxed. Again, not impossible. Rigor resolves irregularly, depending on temperature, body chemistry, and cause of death. But it added to a growing sense that something didn't quite fit. I pressed my palm against his sternum, checking skin temperature. He'd been refrigerated for over 12 hours. He should have been cold, not frozen, but noticeably cool to the touch. He wasn't warm, but he wasn't as cold as he should have been. I made a mental note of it. I told myself it was the room. Our refrigeration unit is old, probably 20 years past its prime. Temperature fluctuates by a degree or two, especially if the door's been opened recently. I positioned his head, tilted it back slightly to expose the neck, and draped the body with a sterile sheet, leaving only the work area visible. I put on my gloves, apron, and face shield, then selected a scalpel from the instrument tray. I made my incision just above the right clavicle, a clean, shallow cut, approximately 2 inches long, to expose the carotid artery and jugular vein. The tissue separated normally, no unusual resistance. Subcutaneous fat, muscle, fascia, all exactly as expected. I used a small retractor to hold the incision open, then located the artery and vein. Both were where they should be, intact and unremarkable. No signs of disease or damage. I ligated the distal ends with surgical thread, then inserted the arterial cannula into the carotid, securing it with another ligature. I did the same with the drainage tube in the jugular. Everything was textbook. Everything was exactly as I'd done it 1,000 times before. I primed the embalming machine, set the pressure to 2 pounds per square inch, standard for an adult male with no apparent circulatory complications, and opened the valve. The fluid began to flow. I watched the pressure gauge and the drainage tube. For the first 30 seconds, everything was normal. The machine hummed steadily. Pressure held at 2 pounds per square inch. Drainage started almost immediately. Dark venous blood threading down the clear tube into the collection basin beneath the table. Then out of nowhere, the pressure spiked. The gauge climbed from 2 pounds per square inch to 4, then 5. I shut off the machine immediately and checked the cannula. No blockage, no kinking in the line. The insertion site looked clean, no signs of vascular collapse or tissue damage. I opened the valve again, watching carefully, and the same thing happened. Pressure climbed steadily, as if the vascular system was constricting against the flow. That shouldn't be possible. Vascular tone collapses after death. Blood vessels lose elasticity. Arteries and veins become passive channels. They don't resist. They can't resist. I reduced the pressure manually, bringing it back down to 1 psi. It held for a moment, then started climbing again, slowly this time, but unmistakably upward. I stopped the machine and examined the body more carefully. No visible swelling, no discoloration that would suggest fluid wasn't distributing properly. The drainage output was normal, maybe even slightly elevated for this stage of the procedure. I checked the embalming fluid itself. Correct mixture, correct temperature. I've been mixing this formula for over a decade. There was nothing wrong with it. I restarted the procedure. This time, I watched the pressure gauge closely. It climbed to 3 pounds per square inch, held, then dropped suddenly to 1. The flow rate became erratic, pulsing almost, though that's not the right word. The machine wasn't pulsing. The fluid flow was steady. But the resistance was changing moment to moment, as if something in the vascular system was alternately accepting and rejecting the fluid. I stopped again. I've embalmed bodies with arterial sclerosis, cirrhosis, extreme edema, even advanced decomposition, all conditions that create abnormal pressure dynamics. This wasn't that. This was pressure responding, as if the circulatory system was still trying to regulate itself. I stood there for a moment, hands on the edge of the table, trying to think it through logically. Sometimes you get air pockets in the line that cause temporary resistance. Sometimes the fluid is slightly too viscous and the flow stutters until it warms up. Sometimes a blood clot shifts and blocks a major vessel, creating back pressure. I've seen all of it before. I bled the line, checked the machine's motor and tubing connections, and started again. The fluid entered smoothly for about 2 minutes. Pressure stayed steady at 2 pounds per square inch. Drainage continued at the expected rate. I began to relax slightly, thinking whatever the problem had been, it was resolving. Then the drainage stopped. Completely. The arterial flow was still going in. I could see the fluid level in the reservoir dropping steadily, but nothing was coming out of the jugular. I clamped the arterial line immediately and checked the drainage tube. Clear. No blockage, no tissue obstruction. I adjusted its position slightly, thinking maybe it had shifted against the vein wall, and released the clamp. Still no drainage. That's when I felt the first real stab of unease. Fluid was going in. It had to be going somewhere. If it wasn't draining, it was accumulating in the vascular system or the tissue. But there was no swelling, no distension in the limbs or torso, no fluid pooling beneath the skin. The body looked exactly as it had when I started. I shut everything down and stepped back from the table. I've had cases where drainage is difficult, post-surgical adhesions, clotting disorders, extreme dehydration. But I've never had a case where drainage stops entirely while arterial flow continues unimpeded and the body shows no physical change whatsoever. I pulled off my gloves and checked the paperwork again, looking for anything I might have missed. Cardiopulmonary failure, no surgery, no anticoagulant therapy, no mention of conditions that would complicate embalming, no medical history beyond controlled hypertension. Nothing in the file explained what was happening on the table. I've learned to trust documentation, medical records, death certificates, hospital notes. They tell you what to expect. They prepare you for complications. When the paperwork says a patient had cirrhosis, you know the liver will be damaged, the vessels fragile, the tissue saturated with fluid. When it says cancer, you know to expect surgical scars, radiation damage, chemotherapy effects. This paperwork told me to expect a straightforward embalming, a routine case. It was lying. I put on fresh gloves and returned to the table. I palpated the torso, arms, and legs carefully, checking for fluid accumulation. The tissue felt normal, firm, cool, no abnormal tension or sponginess that would indicate edema or internal pooling. Then I placed my hand flat against his chest. It was warmer than it had been. Not warm, not body temperature, but warmer than when I'd started 20 minutes ago. I pulled my hand back and stared at him. He looked the same, pallid, still, lips slightly parted, eyes closed. The incision on his neck showed no signs of inflammation or reaction. But now, standing over him, I felt something I hadn't felt before. A resistance that had nothing to do with pressure gauges or drainage tubes. I told myself I was being irrational, that I'd been working alone too long, that I was tired, that I was reading things into a situation that had a perfectly logical explanation I just hadn't found yet. I made myself continue. I reinserted the drainage tube at a slightly different angle, thinking maybe I'd nicked a valve or collapsed the vein during the initial insertion. I opened the arterial line again, this time at minimal pressure, half a psi, barely more than a trickle. The fluid went in, and this time the drainage started again, slowly at first, then with increasing volume. Dark red, then lighter, then the pale pink that indicates successful fluid exchange and dilution. I exhaled. Whatever the issue had been, it seemed to be resolving. I increased the pressure gradually, 1 pound per square inch, then 1.5. The flow stabilized, pressure held steady. Drainage continued at the normal rate. I let it run. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then 15. The body was taking the fluid now, distributing it through the vascular system the way it should. I could see the faint firming of tissue that indicates proper preservation beginning. His color started to shift, still pale, but less gray, more neutral. The kind of change you want to see. I began to think I'd overreacted, that the initial problems had been equipment-related, or the result of some unusual but explainable vascular configuration. Maybe the carotid had a slight stenosis I hadn't noticed. Maybe the blood was thicker than normal, causing temporary blockages. I checked my watch. 8:50. I'd been working for 35 minutes. Another 20, and I'd be ready to move Pamor onto cavity embalming. Then the temperature spiked. I wasn't touching him when it happened, but I could feel the change in the air. A sudden warmth radiating from the table, distinct and undeniable. I put my hand on his forearm. It was hot, not feverish, not alive, but hot in a way that shouldn't be possible for a body that had been dead for more than 36 hours and refrigerated for over half a day. I checked the embalming fluid reservoir. The chemical mixture generates a slight exothermic reaction on contact with tissue. It's normal, expected, part of the preservation process, but nothing like this. And the heat wasn't localized to the injection site. It was systemic, radiating from his core outward through the limbs. I shut off the machine again. The heat didn't dissipate. If anything, it intensified over the next 30 seconds. I placed both hands on his chest and felt warmth spreading beneath my palms, as if his body was generating it from within. I stepped back. My hands were shaking slightly inside the gloves. I stood there, staring at him, my mind racing through every possible explanation. Bacterial activity can generate heat, but not like this. Not in a body this recently deceased and refrigerated. Chemical reactions from the embalming fluid, but I'd used this formula hundreds of times without issue. Equipment malfunction, but the machine was functioning normally. None of it fit. I've been trained to think systematically, to eliminate possibilities until you arrive at an explanation. That's how you handle difficult cases. You rule out equipment failure. You rule out user error. You rule out unusual but documented conditions. Eventually, you arrive at an answer. But what happens when you've ruled out everything and you still don't have an answer? What happens when the only explanation left is one you're not supposed to acknowledge? Then I felt it. Resistance, not physical, not movement. It was the procedure itself, fighting me. The fluid I'd introduced was behaving incorrectly. The vascular system was responding in ways it shouldn't be capable of. The tissue was generating heat that had no biological or chemical explanation I could identify. And somewhere beneath all of that, beneath the professional explanations I was trying to construct, I understood something that made my stomach turn. I was not embalming a body that had finished dying. I don't mean it was alive. I mean it hadn't met the conditions, legally, medical, biological, that permit embalming to occur. And if I continued, I wouldn't be preserving remains. I would be forcing a conclusion that hadn't occurred naturally. That's the line. That's the line you can't cross. I stepped back from the table. My breath was shallow. The prep room felt suddenly smaller, the fluorescent lights too bright, the smell of formaldehyde overwhelming. I looked at him, at the body, at the face that was still expressionless and pale, at the chest that was now noticeably warmer than the surrounding air, and I understood that I had a choice. I could continue. I could override the resistance, increase the pressure, flood the vascular system until the tissue had no choice but to accept the fluid. I could complete the procedure, document it as routine, close the case, and no one would ever know what had happened in this room. It wouldn't even be that difficult. I knew exactly what to do. Increase pressure to 4 pounds per square inch. Force the fluid through. Wait for the tissue to accept it. The body would eventually stop resisting. Everything stops resisting eventually if you apply enough force. But that's not preservation. That's something else, or I could stop. I could acknowledge that something was wrong, that the body was not ready, that continuing would be a violation, not of protocol, not of law, but of something deeper, something fundamental to what this work is supposed to be. I removed my gloves, I turned off the overhead light, I covered him with a drape, and I walked out of the prep room. I called Alan from my office. My hands were still shaking. I didn't tell him everything. I didn't know how. I told him there were complications with the case, that the body was presenting abnormalities I couldn't explain, and that I wasn't comfortable proceeding without his input. He asked what kind of abnormalities. I said vascular resistance, irregular temperature response, and drainage inconsistencies that didn't match any condition I'd encountered before. There was a long pause. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, he said. I hung up and sat at my desk, staring at the intake paperwork spread out in front of me. I read it 3 times, looking for anything that would explain what I'd just experienced. There was nothing. Alan arrived 18 minutes later. I heard his car in the parking lot, then his footsteps in the hallway, heavy, deliberate. He didn't say anything when he reached my office, just looked at me and nodded toward the prep room. "Show me," he said. We walked down the hall together. I unlocked the prep room door and stepped aside to let him enter first. The body was still on the table, draped, exactly as I'd left it. The embalming machine was off. The overhead light was off. The room smelled faintly of formaldehyde and something else, something organic and warm that shouldn't have been there. Alan approached the table slowly. He pulled back the drape and looked at the body for a long moment without speaking. Then he placed his hand on the chest, just as I had. He held it there for 5 seconds, maybe 10. When he pulled his hand away, his expression was carefully neutral. "Wait outside," he said quietly. "Alan, wait outside." I left the prep room and stood in the hallway. Through the door, I could hear movement, drawers opening, instruments being set down, the faint hum of the embalming machine starting up again. He was in there for less than 10 minutes. When he came out, his face was unreadable. He closed the door behind him and locked it. "Go home," he said. "What does that mean?" "It means you're done with this one. I'll handle it from here." "Alan, what did you—" "Go home," he said again. His voice was firm, but not unkind. "Take the rest of the day. Come back Monday." I wanted to argue. I wanted to demand answers. But something in his expression told me there weren't any answers he was willing to give. I didn't argue. I gathered my things, walked out to my car, and sat in the parking lot for 15 minutes, staring at the brick facade of Riverside Memorial. I didn't go back inside. When I returned on Monday, the prep room was empty. The table had been cleaned and sanitized. The body was gone. The paperwork had been removed from my desk. I found Alan in his office. "What happened with the case?" I asked. He didn't look up from his computer. "Family opted for direct cremation. We transferred it Saturday morning." "To where?" "Contractor downstate. It's handled." I knew he was lying. I also knew there was no point in pushing. "All right," I said. 2 weeks later, I was filing intake documents and found a revised log in the cabinet. The case was listed under the date it had arrived, September 26th, but my name wasn't on it. Someone else, someone I'd never heard of, had signed as the embalmer of record. I didn't ask Alan about it. Over the next 3 months, I noticed a shift in my assignments. Nothing overt, nothing I could point to as retaliation or punishment. But the complex cases, the ones that required judgment, experience, discretion, started going to other staff. I was given the straightforward cases, routine work, elderly patients who died in nursing homes, heart attacks, strokes, nothing that required more than basic competence. The message was clear. I'd lost Alan's trust. Not because I'd done something wrong, but because I'd refused to do something wrong. That distinction matters, even if no one ever says it out loud. I started documenting everything more carefully. Every intake, every observation, every decision. I told myself it was professional diligence, but really I was building a record. Evidence that I was following protocol, that I wasn't the problem, but I was the problem. Not because I'd made a mistake, because I'd seen something Alan didn't want seen. I stayed for another 4 months, then submitted my notice. Alan didn't ask why. We shook hands on my last day. He thanked me for my years of service and wished me well. We both knew what we weren't talking about. I work at a smaller home now, an hour north of Riverside. The owner is a woman in her 60s who's been in the business longer than I've been alive. She doesn't ask a lot of questions. She trusts her staff to know their limits. I still embalm. I'm still licensed. I follow the same procedures I always have, but I refuse cases differently now. If the intake feels rushed, I ask more questions. If the paperwork is incomplete or inconsistent, I don't proceed until it's corrected. If the family has made unusual requests without clear explanation, I defer to someone else. And if a body presents inconsistencies I can't explain, temperature, pressure, tissue response, anything that suggests the process isn't working the way it should, I stop. I don't push through. I don't override. I don't force it. I've walked away from 3 cases in the past 18 months for reasons I couldn't fully articulate to my employer. Each time, she's accepted my judgment without question. I think she knows, I think she's seen it too, or something like it, and understands that some decisions can't be explained. I think she understands that some refusals aren't about fear. They're about recognizing a line you're not supposed to cross. I don't say the body that night was alive. I don't say it was anything supernatural or paranormal. I don't claim to understand what was happening on that table or why it was happening. I say this: whatever was on that table did not meet the conditions required for embalming, and I will never forgive myself for how close I came to pretending it did.